So what I want to say is structured in 4 parts. First of all, a bit of the background, former times before most of you were born, life before traffic calming. And secondly, the traffic calming guidelines themselves, and I'll give you some hints as to the content, although hopefully you know it cover to cover. And thirdly, my reflections on what the progress has been over the past 20 years. And lastly, fourthly, just a reflection on what might be happening in the years to come. We'll then, as Amanda explained, have some discussion with our little panel of experts. And I think I would not mind if people wanted to ask questions along the way, at the risk of sort of getting me off my train of thought. I'm quite happy if people have some burning question along the way which doesn't involve a half-an-hour answer. We can do that. That gives me a one-up on the panel to start with. And if we've got time later on, and if you've all got the energy for it, we've got a couple of movies which I find are useful to stimulate discussion on the shared space issue in general and the reaction of road users one to the other in general. So we might do that. Managed to get the technology to play those things. That's an added thing if we wish. The pre-traffic calming era, I've dubbed it divide and rules, because the philosophy was that motor traffic is not compatible with everything else, and therefore we have to divide it off from pedestrians, cyclists, from living spaces, and so on. Hence the divide. The rules, well, as the motor vehicle made its presence felt, and as it started slaughtering people in ever greater numbers, regulations were introduced, both for drivers and pedestrians and others, to try to get them to behave in a way which is with less fatal and serious consequences. We look back at some of the things I'm about to show you and think, my God, did we really think that was an answer? But at the time, it must have seemed perhaps a reasonable response faced with these numbers. 1920, after the First World War, almost 3,000 people killed annually on the roads, which had risen to 7,000 by 1930. I mean, that's just huge. And the current number is more or less back down to where it was in 1920. So the missing bit of the graph shows a steady decline, certainly after the 1950s. So we have achieved a lot in bringing the fatality rate down, despite obviously a massive increase in the volume of traffic, or some would say because of the increase in the amount of traffic. At the beginning of that there were sort of 3 decades really, from the 40s to the 80s, when, to our way of thinking, or my way of thinking, perhaps things went a bit awry. And it started perhaps with a little book produced by an ex-police commissioner, Alka Tripp. You just see the cover of it lurking there, which inspired the ministry to produce a booklet called Design and Layout of Roads in Built-Up Areas. That book is a magnificent piece of work, and most of it sort of suggests that all our urban areas should be laced with dual carriageways and motorways. And where you can't put a dual carriageway through, like the Strand, although that was tried. And in other places, this drawing shows a suggestion for how you might deal with the pedestrian and traffic conflict, i.e. by shoving the pedestrians in tunnels underground. And that idea of segregation of the different traffic participants was also picked up in the Buchanan report, Traffic in Towns, in 1963. And that, in turn, was picked up by the department in a very boring way. Roads in Urban Areas, possibly one of the most uninspiring documents ever to be issued from the department. Also continued this idea of segregating. Each of those three documents contained proposals for road hierarchies, basically big roads, middle roads, and less important roads, in most cases 4 categories. But the 1946 one is quite interesting, and also even the 1963 one from Buchanan, because the old traditional street structure at the local level is more or less still present, a sort of a grid, albeit truncated because of the need to allow major roads to pass. But there's still some kind of recognizable urban form there of a sort which we would applaud today. But the 1966 one, Roads in Urban Areas, all of that has gone. And the ideal layout, as perceived by the ministry at the time, is really what I would describe as loops and lollipops for the local road system. And hence all the wiggledy-piggledy housing estates that we've seen in the decades since. Segregation works of wonder. Alka Tripp set the ball rolling in 1942 with this sketch of how to deal with, I'm not sure where it is, the Strand, I think, with our upper level, first floor walkway and bridges to get pedestrians out of the way of the traffic. In fact, that solution was actively proposed and was for a long time part of the planning rules in the City of Edinburgh, where Princes Street was proposed to have an upper level walkway. And in fact, some of the buildings which were redeveloped post-war still have the stub ends of the walkways stuck on them. They didn't sort of think through that you'd have to rebuild the entire street before it could be complete. So you're left with this kind of silly nonsense of the unfortunate buildings from the 60s and 70s. And Buchanan again allowed his artists free rein with this sort of fantasy of being able to segregate all types of traffic. Traffic rules, well, we all know about them. There are many, many of them, and too many of them displayed in signs. But I thought I'd include, because usually it's sort of pedestrians being asked to beware of traffic, but in this case, if you can read it, it's inviting drivers to beware of pedestrians. I think that woman there is pulling a gun out of her bag. So in 1990, Devon came to the rescue. I was at a conference in Paris. This, the cover of the conference booklet is shown there. And after my presentation, I was heading towards a local bar, as you do, and Mike Hatt, who was then chief planner at Devon County Council, drew me aside and said, could he buy me a Pernod? I said, well, I don't like Pernod, but you can buy me something else. So we sat down at a cafe table, and he suggested to me that things were going awry in terms of street design. Would I help them to produce a guide, a design guide for the county on how to rebuild their streets and traffic manage them in such a way that speeds would be slower and the environment would be better. In other words, the opposite of the segregation philosophy, more towards integration of traffic users for everybody's benefit. Well, what is traffic calming? I think we struggled a bit with the definition, but the one that came into the document was more or less this. The approach is to adapt the volume, speed, and behaviour of traffic to the primary functions of the streets through which it passes, rather than to adapt streets to the unbridled demands of motor vehicles. And I think Ed's introduction also sort of gave us a good flavour of what they were about. One of the key things then was to acknowledge that streets do more than just act as conduits for motor vehicles, and lots of people are doing different things with different motives, at different speeds, and at different times and different places. And so this drawing sort of tried to convey that within a single street you have many types of people and many agendas going on simultaneously. And that the design, whatever it might be, had to take account of those, and priorities would have to be given to one or the other, because a lot of the interests of these people will be in conflict. Another important thing was that we didn't abandon the idea of a road hierarchy, but we put it in a different way. We felt that in reality there are two categories of street which we could acknowledge, and the one and most important is living streets, or living areas as we preferred to call it, and the other was traffic areas. Well, the traffic areas are not in dispute when you're talking about motorways, because other classes of traffic are banned. The living areas can approach almost up to the motorway level of, in the hierarchy, if you like. So it was basically two categories of area, but we had a third, which we called mixed priority areas, and these were ones where, by and large, it was on a road or a street which had an important traffic function, but where it passed through, for example, a shopping parade or a local centre or even a town centre, where lots of other things were going on, lots of pedestrians would be seeking to cross and so on. And these areas, it was not desirable to continue the traffic priority going through. And I think that's a very important, for me, it was one of the innovative aspects of the guidelines. And as far as I know, this hasn't really been picked up very much since. In particular, when we look at the diagram which appeared in the guidelines showing how this might work, the larger of the grey lines are the traffic areas, the traffic streets or roads, and the orange bits are those which we've described as mixed priority, where the traffic should give way in terms of speed to other activities that are going on. And what you notice about that is, unlike the hierarchies in the diagrams I showed you earlier, the categories here are discontinuous, or at least the traffic category is discontinuous because it's being asked to relent where the mixed activities are going on. And this idea of a discontinuous hierarchy or category within the hierarchy, as far as I know, has not really been picked up, with the possible exception of Lincoln Place, which Peter Jones sitting here was responsible for, which addressed the issue of these mixed priority areas in great detail and emphasised the importance of that category within the overall network. So, but apart from Lincoln Place, it's sort of manual for streets too as well, but I wasn't particularly involved in that, and it doesn't emphasise it in the way I would have tried to do. Now, moving on, the traffic calming guidelines included 19 measures that were identified as traffic calming measures. And you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to describe these one by one. But I would like to pick out one or two things that are interesting. We tried to grade these measures according to their impact on traffic speed, based on research as far as it was available, mostly, I have to say, from Germany and the Netherlands. And the top of the list, and the only one which received a category A in terms of speed reduction, was vertical shifts in the carriageway, which to most people translates as speed humps or road humps. People don't like damage to their vehicle, and by and large they tend to slow down when they see them. And that has quite a powerful effect because it's pure self-interest. But the others can have quite a strong effect too, shifts in the carriageway laterally, roundabouts, mini roundabouts, and so on. There's not a lot which was particularly new in itself, although there were one or two things that were new in the top category there. But the remainder of the 19 were what were described as supporting environmental and safety measures. And these were things which we had evidence, which used in combination could produce a speed reduction effect, or at least a calmer style of driving, a greater respect on the part of the driver for what was going on. And quite a few of those sorts of measures, and I'll pick on one or two to talk about. The other thing that was hinted at again by Ed Cholton was that the majority of traffic calming schemes that have been introduced have consisted mostly of humps of one kind or another, and to some extent width restrictions. And my God, there's quite a lot of ugly ones around if you look. And we've got under the third column there, visual enhancement of the street scene, tick or cross, and you'll see that vertical shifts in the carriageway and lateral shifts in the carriageway are not considered to enhance the street scene, and yet they are the measures which have been most used. So in other words, from a design point of view, all the palette of measures that are available have largely been ignored, with obviously some notable exceptions. But the bog standard 20-mile-an-hour zone tends not to emphasize measures which would improve the appearance of the street. This is a little, it's always been a bugbear of mine. Large corner radii are bad news for pedestrians. And in the guidelines, I set out all of the reasons why that was the case. And, well, I won't go into the detail, but anybody who's crossed a side road will have their own experience of it. But it was I'm quite glad that it did also find its way in a slightly modified form in Manual for Streets. Another interesting measure, which again has sort of been sadly neglected, but is quite common in other countries, is what are sometimes called occasional strips. This has nothing to do with the gentleman's club. That this is the division of the carriageway into what is essentially a vehicle carriageway alongside a cycle carriageway, but not necessarily marked as a cycle carriageway. So it's a strip, which is different materials or colour. And what happens is that a car can pass a cycle quite easily, as you can just about see in the far distance of that photograph. But when a large vehicle comes, if there happens to be a cycle there, the large vehicle must proceed at the speed of the cycle, which the large vehicle then slows down everything which follows that. This is the outer ring road in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and it's a dual carriageway, so you can't see the other carriageway because of all the planting. But it works very well, because on an outer ring road, A, you get a lot of large vehicles, and B, in Holland, you get a lot of cyclists. So the speed on that road is low. Another measure which was pretty much unfamiliar in Britain at the time was the concept of reducing the optical width of the street. This was a sort of German translation. It's a bit clunky, really. Optical width sounds a bit scientific. Basically, what you're doing is bringing vertical elements of a decent height close to where the driver would be, and it creates a sort of tunnel-like effect, which does and has been demonstrated to reduce the driver's speed. This is actually in Balham, near to where I live. Cushions you're all familiar with, speed cushions. Here are the first ones to be laid anywhere in the world, and they're quite different and in purpose and concept from the ones which we have in Britain, by and large. They were designed primarily to allow, to slow car drivers, but allow cyclists free passage. I never quite felt it worked because the granite sets which were laid are very uncomfortable for cyclists anyway. And they also found in the research of the impact of this scheme that actually the safety record, the safety of cyclists was worse after the implementation of this than before. And I think the same would be found of speed cushions that we have as well. Anybody who's cycled along the road with speed cushions will know that drivers cut you in their attempts to get straddling the speed cushion. So anyway, I could go on all evening about speed cushions. There's a load of issues around them. But here is one which I thought was fairly intelligent. It's placed in advance of where pedestrians are crossing, and it's placed in such a way that the buses can pass over it without too much of a bump. Sometime in the early 1980s, I went all the way to Mainz in Germany to see this raised crossing at a side road, which has a cycle track and pedestrian path as well. And it leads from the main road into what we would perhaps call a home zone or a Wohnauf. It's ironic, really, because I travelled all that way and spent all that money, and now you get them at the end of the street where you live. So I suppose it's quite gratifying, really. But they do provide, of course, tremendous benefits to people with wheelchairs and buggies and such, and people who aren't very steady on their feet, and unfortunately also a bit attractive to cyclists, as you can see there. Shared space, well, we think we know about shared space these days, but really it started in the Netherlands a long, long time ago, almost 40 years ago now. And this is a scheme from Nijmegen, and it's often thought that shared space is a space without rules. And I think this is unfortunate notion that people have, because in the Netherlands they thought it was very important to have good rules in association with these schemes. I don't want to go into too much detail, but suffice it to say that a lot of home zones, the so-called equivalent in Britain, don't work because they lack those rules. Now, I was intrigued with the idea that very early on in this guidelines process, what is it that actually slows drivers down? There is no physical thing between the traffic calming measure, whatever it is, and the mechanism of the car. There's nothing acting on the car. It's something which is acting on the driver's brain. The driver is saying to himself, I'll get a nasty bump if I go over that too fast, or I might crash if I go around that corner too fast. So it's all down to a connection between whatever it is in the street and what the driver is thinking. And so that was what led me to think, well, it's perfectly natural then. It doesn't have to be a 20-mile-an-hour limit sign. It could be trees in the street, or it could be people walking along the street, or it could be anything of an impression which acts on the brain to convey to the driver that he should be doing something different other than speeding through. So recently I was discussing this with my daughter, and I was saying, can you think of anything that would act directly on the car so that the car would slow down regardless of what the driver was thinking? And this is what she came up with. I thought it was rather good. So, spilling glue on the road. Maybe it's not a bad idea. So this was what led on, and of course, armed with all the wonderful schemes and experiences from the Netherlands and in Germany, Denmark to some extent, and Switzerland. The idea came, and it was very powerful in the Devon, in Ed Chalton's mind and others in Devon, that it wasn't just a question of shoving in humps to slow people down. It was a question of making the environment attractive and look to the driver as if it was doing something other than just acting as a highway. So this was a before and after drawing in the guidelines. But not all of this advice has been followed, and sometimes it's been done in a rather unthinking way. Personally, the home zone on the left, I find that a bit like, okay, it's if you see the street as a work of art or something, but it doesn't, to me, convey what it's trying to do. And the one on the right is very confused because it's a 20-mile-an-hour home zone. Well, home zones are meant to be walking pace driving, and the sign, which is supposed to be a home zone sign, is some sort of local interpretation of the international sign, which has never been adopted in Britain anyway. So all a bit confused. The blinding pace of change. I came across this book, which I wrote in 1983. Well, it's hardly a book, it's a research monograph when I was an academic. And it said, I was surprised to read the other day, setting standards of design is a hazardous business and can never be a substitute for creative and sensitive design. I thought I'd sort of learnt things recently, but it turns out I've known it all along. Traffic calming guidelines said design should be influenced by the character of the surroundings rather than by traffic requirements. And Manual for Streets said highway authorities are encouraged to take a more flexible approach to allow for designs that respond to their surroundings and create a sense of place. So it's all been around a long time.